Somebody killed the driver, injured the passenger.
Everybody here has got a ringside seat for what just happened.
But people that live that lifestyle, you don't snitch.
Listen to me. You're going to tell me some truth.
She knows what she knows. She's just not come forward.
Does that look like that guy you were talking about?
No. I don't know his name.
I don't know where it came from.
I don't know. I did not see his face.
It was very obvious to everyone in the courtroom that she was terrified. If we did not get these witnesses, we were not going to have a case.
This could result in an acquittal.
For those most affected by a homicide, the first 48 is just the beginning.
Richard was a blessing in my life.
This is the story of the fight for justice.
Ultimately, they stepped up to the challenge. They are heroes to me.
In the weeks, months, and years.
East side that they're calling for.
Patrol officers alert emergency dispatch.
They've got somebody flagged them down, 2 shooting victims at the tonight's inn.
Inside a parked SUV, they find a man and a woman shot.
Before, make sure there's 2 empty units down there. Start the crime scene. You can already start homicide. We have 1 definitely down. 10-4, get them going. We have 1 business.
It's a lower-end motel, single story. Several years ago, I did some undercover work in that complex, so I'm vaguely familiar with it.
I was the lead detective up for the next homicide. I had been a detective for around 5 years. Now I've been a detective doing this for almost 14 years. I'm just a lot different. I think that I'm a lot more patient, honestly, and I'm a lot nicer than I probably was back then. I already knew that it was going to be challenging. You have people that have used that place for their business. It's just one of those kind of places.
There's money going through there, there's sex going on in there, there's drugs going on in there, and there's vendettas. And those are the 4 things people die from: money, sex, drugs, and vendettas.
The vehicle was still running. It was parked right in front of room 116 inside of the complex. What do you got?
Somebody pulled up beside this white car, fired shots into it, killed the driver, injured the passenger.
33-year-old Amber Stevens is being treated at a nearby hospital for a gunshot wound to the neck.
Hopefully that person will pull through, because then we have a real witness.
His name was Richard Parker.
Richard Parker, known as Pizzo, was a devoted father and grandfather. He had struggled with drug addiction. He was 57.
He's got his cell phone clutched in his hand.
Let's get him out of the car.
He's got 2 in his shoulder. He's got like 1 above his ear and one right in his jaw.
Pizzo was shot 5 times.
It looks like a .22 in his pocket. Clearly, he didn't see this threat coming, or he would have been ready for it. So whoever did this had the element of surprise working for him. This guy just walked up there plain as day, in broad daylight, and did this.
I don't know about video that's in the surrounding area.
She said that they don't work.
All right.
With little evidence to go on.
We're yanking everybody downtown that we can.
Okay. This is kind of a horseshoe complex. People are watching and seeing who's rolling in here and stuff, because they're always on the lookout for police and so forth.
Anybody else in here?
Everybody here has got a ringside seat for what just happened.
But nobody's going to want to talk to us initially. Close the place! It's just our turn to turn up the heat a little bit in that little horseshoe. Is everybody okay in here?
We'll get more information than what we've got right now, that's for sure.
These cases, you have to let them breathe a little bit. It just might take us a little longer than others.
Three hours in, the witnesses the team rounded up will have to wait.
The first shooting victim has already been released.
White wants the woman who survived to be interviewed first.
The bullet got removed from her neck.
They pulled it out intact. It appears to be a large caliber weapon. You know, she's lucky to be walking. So I will go talk to her.
In an optimal situation, we would like to wait a couple of days before we were able to actually sit down and talk with a victim. But if you wait, she may be intimidated, may be threatened, may move on and become incredibly difficult to find.
Okay, Amber. You comfortable as much as possible? You okay? Okay. I just need you to be truthful with me. How did you get hooked up with Pizzo today?
It wasn't nothing new for us to pull in over there. I've been in.
Amber says she occasionally helps Pizzo deliver drugs at the motel.
So today wasn't really nothing different.
She just happened to be in the wrong place, wrong time.
So you guys pull in front of this room. Then what happened?
She came over to the window. Remember anything?
She says a woman started talking with Pizzo.
And all I remember is her saying is she needs some ice.
Okay.
Ice is a street term for crystal methamphetamine. This may have been a setup to try to distract him.
You know this lady chick personally?
No, I do not. I don't remember anything about the conversation. I don't even know what I was doing. When I was sitting there in the car, I don't know where it came from. The pops went off. It was just like somebody had taken like a trash bag and just just went really fast. I don't know if somebody was running. I don't know. I really don't.
She said, I didn't see the shooter. It was disappointing.
Amber had stated that there was another woman that was speaking to Richard Parker. I wanted to find who she was. That's the number one way that we've solved these cases, by just starting to talk to people. And we had a huge roundup.
Hey, I need you to wake up for me if you don't mind. Tell me what happened today.
It sounded like the loudest firecracker you got.
Were you there to buy dope? Or?
Yeah, I do my dope. I ain't gonna lie.
All right, what happened?
Somebody's dead. That was all I know.
You saw nothing. Half the other people standing out there saw nothing. I heard shots. I didn't look.
Like you said, just watch the golf tournament.
Are you high right now? You're killing me.
After hours in the interview room.
So you don't know nothing about nothing?
All right. I really did have hope. And to my surprise, we got nothing. You're just dealing with people that float around a lot. Everybody works with street names or first names, and nobody knows last names. But that's just what we're dealing with.
We weren't getting the full story. We weren't going to get a quick solve. It just wasn't going to happen right away.
We were really in a bad spot at this point. I needed heroes.
8 hours into the investigation.
We left 2 detectives behind at the complex. Maybe some additional witnesses may come forward. And in fact, Nathan Schilling called me up.
Go ahead.
Hey, got your star witness.
Great. What's the story?
He sees the shooting.
Yes, that's what I'm talking about. All right. Good. That's good stuff right there.
An hour later, the eyewitness who lives at the motel comes forward.
I appreciate you coming down here.
You really are hoping for somebody that's going to tell you what they saw, what they actually saw.
Tell me what happened today.
She comes over and she was talking to my wife, and then my wife was...
He says a woman who stays at the motel stopped by their room.
She's a working girl.
She white?
Yeah, she's white. Blonde hair. It's very, very curly. She's shorter than me. I want to say she's not fat. She's thick. She started telling my wife these stories.
The woman said that a few weeks ago, Pizzo robbed and shot another man.
Yeah, she's supposed to just got out of the hospital. And when she said that, I realized the situation was serious.
The woman claimed the man who was shot told her he wanted revenge on Pizzo.
So he can, you know what I'm saying, I guess kill him.
The woman said Pizzo and the man he allegedly shot were both at the motel.
And I told her, she need to get away from her. Well, I got my kids here. We shut the door, and I'm peeking out the window. He gets in the car.
He says Pizzo was about to leave with Amber when the woman approached Pizzo's SUV.
The car tried to pull us up.
What does he do?
He had a gun. And as soon as he hit the window, he started letting shots go. Pop, 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 pop. I think it was like four to six shots. Dude fell over. Fell over. And he went back to his car. And it hurts me.
Man, it's all right to cry.
He's genuine and he's emotional. And when you see that, you can't make that up. He seemed believable. I said, hey man, I need some help. You're hoping that you're gonna be able to piece this thing together and get what we need to do our job.
I need a name. I need a name like now.
Look at her. Look at that.
Richard's childhood caregiver, Margaret, her daughter, Tracy, and Richard's sister, Priscilla, remember him.
Richard was born in Omaha, Nebraska. He was not raised by his parents. The kids were given to his aunt. Show that picture, Auntie.
Richard abandoned at birth, but taken on by an adopted family member that loved him, Annie.
She's the one that raised both me and my two brothers.
Annie had asked me would I watch the kids when they come home from school because she would be at work.
You stepped in, and we culturally, we've had to. We've had to stand in the gap.
That village power that was it's in our blood. And when we talk about a village, it's an African proverb. It means that I am watching out for you and you are watching out for me. And he missed his mom. Even when he was smiling, I saw the unhappiness in his eyes.
And the cards that were dealt to him, the life that he had growing up, we can understand the decisions that he made. Not that we agree with it, but we also see the good in him and the good that existed in him.
It was the drugs that kept him down when he was on the drugs. He didn't have to think about all the other things. No mom, no dad. I was not mom, and I knew that. But I never stopped being that mother figure for him.
We were like this close away from having 2 people killed.
9 hours into the investigation.
I think he was traumatized by what he had seen. And you could tell that, but when I needed information about the suspect.
I don't know his name.
You know my street name?
My wife did.
It's nice to know that there are some people that exist out there in the world that don't want these individuals out there running around. He led us another piece to the puzzle.
Patrol picks up the eyewitness's wife.
Tell me what happened.
Probably like a week ago. What's her name? I can't pronounce her name. She told me that the guy Pizzo was after Pizzo, and he wanted her to knock on the door to get him to come outside so he could kill him. So it was probably about 5, maybe. She came to my room, she said, they're both here. I was standing there looking out the window, and I seen the gold car.
She was able to provide me additional information. The suspect drove a gold Ford Fusion.
And then he jumped out of his car and ran up. I mean, I saw him like 5 or 6 times.
I need some help telling me a name. Do you have any ideas?
Giovanni or something like that. Giovanni or something like that.
She says she doesn't know if Giovanni is the suspect's real name.
He looked like he was maybe 5'7", 5'8", maybe. Dark-skinned.
Her husband and her, they stepped up to the challenge, and they are heroes to me.
Let's try Facebook.
I started trying to do variations of Giovanni.
Let's try that.
We didn't have anything else to work with.
Hey, bro. Hey. Does that look like that guy you were talking about?
No.
couldn't say enough about their level of cooperation.
On him.
I don't know that there's anything else we can do. At this point, you're spent.
13 hours in,
I'm going to be giving an undercover narcotics guy a call. He's kind of what I would consider one of my soldiers out there.
White's best hope to identify his suspect, Giovanni, could be finding the woman who knows him.
Hey, bro, what's up? Over there at the inn, who's the chick that looks like she's thick?
Do
your thing, bro. All right, bye. All right, we'll see what that happens. You plant the seeds and see if the garden will grow.
I put the word out on the streets that, man, I'm looking for this person. Both cops and individuals.
There's going to be those of us that have informants can go out there and say, who is this person? Who's talking? It's not rocket science. It's looking.
She'll pop out. She's probably in a motel room right now.
I am literally driving up and down these streets, 16 hours, in hopes we were just going to see her.
Somebody's going to know her.
After 20 hours of searching.
Yeah. What street? What street?
A confidential informant tells White where he can find the woman who may have set Pizzo up.
Where?
And I got over there as quick as I could. It took me about 3 minutes.
Where is she? She on foot?
Somewhere right here. She's on foot. She may have jumped in a vehicle.
Gosh.
By that time, she's already in another car.
Has a white shirt pulled up behind her head.
All right. Keep looking. God bless. Freaking kidding me.
That's her.
Get up in the front seat.
This girl, in my mind, either she's got something to do with this, which would explain why she hasn't reached out to us, or she knows the suspect.
Listen to me. Here's what you need to be worried about right now. You're going to tell me some truth. You know what I mean? Or you're going to be in some big trouble.
I was already kind of wound up, and I hadn't even met her yet. I didn't even know her name.
I didn't mean to get upset with you. Been looking for you for freaking days.
Is the girl okay?
She's gonna live.
When she asked me about how the female was, then I knew that she knew a little bit more.
As the first 48 winds down.
Now we just have to get her to where she's comfortable enough to be able to tell us about who this suspect really is and help us out.
Your honesty is gonna be what decides what I'm gonna do with you.
I had heard that Pizzo had shot somebody recently, I guess.
Who did he shoot?
A guy named Giovanni. I had heard that.
She says Jelani recently got out of the hospital and was angry at Pizzo about the shooting.
I felt like I was in the middle because I was friends with Pizzo and I was friends with Jelani.
She knew the suspect and the victim. She's conflicted because she's in that spot.
Okay, and then what happened?
Pizzo called me out to the car and I was standing there and I'm talking to him. I seen a guy running towards me and I stepped back and that's when he shot Pizzo.
Who's he?
I don't know. Factually, I did not see his face. I'm not saying that it wasn't Jelani, but I can't tell you that it was Jelani either.
You know exactly who shot him. My blood was boiling a little bit. I really wasn't in the mood to play games.
Why are you being so towards me?
Because I've been wasting my...
Pizzo was my friend too. You understand that? Pizzo was my friend.
She was getting on to me. She was hurting, and I guess I needed to be reminded of that.
The word on the streets is that you helped set this up.
Nobody's ever asked me to set anybody up. I didn't call Bizo over there. He just showed up.
I believe most of what she said, but I have no doubt in my mind she knows that it was him. She was in a real emotional spot. She liked the suspect, and she liked the victim. That's a tough thing that we're asking her to do.
She's upset. She knows what she knows. She's just not come forward.
Jelani, did he give you his number?
It's in there.
Then we get a phone number for him, which was great, and then we let her go.
As far as her being in the planning of this, no. I'm not feeling that now.
We're going to find her again. That's our hope.
Three days in,
John Brown found a connection with the phone number that we had.
Cordarius Scott. He's got a lengthy record, got some assault, dangerous drugs.
This is big.
We're going to take it to my witnesses. What they do identify him, then that's huge. How you doing? Okay, I'm going to show you a series of pictures. I want you to take your time. I want you to scan through the individual that you know as Jelani may or may not be in here, okay? And then he comes out and picked out Cordarius, so that was enough for us to be able to move forward here. See, my man, the feeling that you have at that moment is just, it's hard to describe. I mean, you were really invested. All right, one of my witnesses positively ID'd our suspect. You're hard charging. You just don't give up, and you keep pushing and pushing and pushing, and it pays off.
I'm going to give you guys where we're at right now and what we need, basically. We have a close working relationship with our fugitive warrants team. We tell them we're looking for a car. Jelani drives the gold Ford with tinted windows. I'm 90% sure that he's the shooter.
On the bright side, there's 85 Ford Focuses registered to the town of Tulsa.
Well, there was a little sarcasm. We're only looking for that one. I don't know how, but we're going to find it.
We ready?
while White and Leatherman stake out a motel where the woman who knows Cordarius is staying.
We're actually sitting in the Knights Inn parking lot.
The Warrants Squad sweeps the surrounding neighborhood.
Now that we got the name, it's just a matter of finding him. It's time to make sure we catch him before he hurts again.
A gold Ford Fusion at 56 in Cincinnati coming east.
I don't know if that's really him, but they seem to think that it looked like him.
Back southbound on 169. I see you coming.
We wanted to have more cars in the event that this ends up being a pursuit. You just didn't know what was going to happen next.
He's going to pull into the park. Anybody else up with me?
That's it right there. You have serious concerns because we're in a freaking drive-through, for God's sake. That is not the optimal spot to be able to do something like this.
I'm not sure what he's going to try to do.
Come out the driver's side. Pop that door open.
We were just hoping that nobody was hurt in the process.
Start walking backwards towards my boys. Now you walk towards the guy in the red shirt.
And then he was brought downtown. certain way. You've been very patient, and I appreciate it. Do you go by these street names? Jelani? He denied that he was Jelani. He denied that that's his phone number.
Did you get shot recently? Like about a month ago?
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
Man, I was trying to break up a fight. These was out there fighting and trying to break it up.
He didn't even confess to getting shot by Pizzo.
So I want to talk to you about what happened at the inn.
You've been identified out there. We have evidence to put you there.
And that's what you're here for.
If you do not want to talk to me, you're going to go to jail. I don't have a choice but to go off of what we've got.
I'm saying, what do you mean I'm going to jail? I'm not even registering that. What am I going to jail for?
Murder.
I know that he comes across as relatively calm, but he was super nervous because he didn't know what we had.
How you just going to put that on me?
I have nothing else to go off of other than what I have from witnesses that were out there and the evidence at the scene. You may have a reason for what happened.
Cordarius, he could have some sort of an explanation. Maybe he was super mad about being shot, where he felt like he had every right in the world to retaliate, which would have led him to admit to some of these things. That's what I needed.
If y'all feel like y'all got some evidence to take me to jail on some then let's go to jail, man. I'm not finna sit here and talk to y'all about some that I ain't got nothing to do with.
That is your right, man. You're going to go to jail today for murder.
Experience tells us guilty people will do that. They deny, and they deny.
Stand up, put your hands behind your back.
Camera out my face.
Cordarius Scott, known as Jelani, is charged with first-degree murder and assault with a deadly weapon.
This guy's acting like it's just nothing. I think that it's just revenge, is what it was.
We've got some exceptional prosecutors that are very good at their jobs. But we already knew it was going to be a tough case.
We don't have fingerprints. We don't have video. So the people that saw what happened are so crucial.
With the preliminary hearing only 2 months away,
We had to make sure that we could get 3, 4, 5, 6 witnesses, as many as we possibly could, so that we could adequately tell the story to the jury of what happened.
When I spoke to Julie Doss, we already knew it was going to be miserable to get all these witnesses corralled. We're talking transient people that go all over the place.
The victim witness advocates makes the initial contact with any of these witnesses. In this case, I had Heather Jordan.
This case was a lot of work because it's people that don't want to be found, and I'm responsible for keeping them around and found for potentially years.
If we did not get these witnesses, we were not going to have a case.
As time goes on and the word in the streets, people start talking, the witnesses became much less cooperative.
Even as early as the preliminary hearing, warrants were already having to be issued for various witnesses.
Amber was a challenge.
When I was sitting there in the car, I don't know where it came from. The pops went off.
A victim of a crime is not forced to testify. Not only was she shot, but she was scared. She has a right to say, I don't want to do this.
The initial charges in this case included an assault and battery with a deadly weapon regarding Amber. So I felt it imperative that we have Amber Stevens testify.
Amber did not appear for the preliminary hearing.
So that count was dismissed at prelim. That was a bad day.
Now our focus was on the murder count. This is going to be difficult.
What that did was just solidify the absolute need to get every witness possible for the trial of this case. This is the diagram of the Tonight Inn. This was important for the jury to see where everyone was when this was going on. Here was Richard Parker. In the passenger seat was Amber. We had witnesses right here in room 108. The glue, if you will, was the witness standing right here by the vehicle when Richard was shot. That witness is the person that every other witness mentions as being there and having information about what was going to happen. She was essential to get justice.
She was not at all on board with testimony. I'm not doing this. You can't make me. I'm not coming. She was brought before the judge. She convinces the judge that she'll show up, she's sorry.
She was released, but with an ankle monitor.
And those ankle monitors are tracked. There's places you can go and places you can't go. And there's this very clear list of rules as to the ankle monitor.
Within 48 hours of her being released, she cut off her monitor.
It's cut, it's done, it's dead. She was scared. There's a culture of you don't work with the police. She was willing to go to jail to avoid being involved.
At that point, Heather and I were beside ourselves because we didn't know if we were going to find her again.
We knew how imperative she was, and Detective White asked for help to find her.
The fugitive group spent a lot of time coordinating and working with the DA's office to find the witness. How does one find someone that doesn't want to be found? There's a little bit of luck involved. You're at the mercy of the witnesses in and around that area that would provide you with, yes, I saw an individual that fit that description. We begin to identify what we call frequency points that we can then begin to surveil. We were able to finally, as a collective group, locate her and bring her back in. It is rewarding when you work together as a team.
We requested she be held without any kind of bond. And she was in jail for months waiting on the trial.
As Das prepares for Cordarius Scott's court date, the witness who knows him poses a new challenge.
She was still hesitant to be forthcoming with the information that we knew she had, information that she had already told the detectives. These are not trick questions. This is not a test. You've already said these things. She kind of dug her heels in and was like, nope, I don't remember.
It's very customary in a prosecution interview to show an individual their video with the police. And that was offered. I had never had this happen before. She didn't want to watch the video.
She was very defiant, would not do it.
Her not wanting to admit that she had told certain things to the police, that shows the extreme fear that it appeared she had of testifying against Cordarius Scott. But we didn't know if she was going to tell the truth on the stand. Without her, it's going to be difficult to get a conviction.
I was very concerned, as was Julie. This could result in an acquittal.
Absolute hours upon hours upon hours to get this case ready for trial. We were all very focused.
So Julie and I got together and we were going over every witness She was running with a group of people that were involved in criminal activity.
She was also in that vehicle. He was an eyewitness to the shooting.
He and his wife were raising small kids at this hotel.
He IDs Cordelia Scott as the shooter.
She was emotional about the entire situation.
This witness was able to corroborate the stories of the others.
She's living a lifestyle that is extremely dangerous, mainly on the streets.
Probably single most important witness. This witness is corroborating this witness, is corroborating this witness. Maybe one of these witnesses alone might not convince a jury, but when you put all 6 of them together, aha. I think all of us had a few butterflies because we didn't know what these witnesses were going to be willing to say, if they were going to be truthful.
As Das calls each to the stand, her strategy plays out before the jury.
There was enough evidence that lined up between them that was important enough information to trust. The bits and pieces that were said, I believed.
The jury is getting to see these individuals that clearly don't want to be testifying, but they're giving this information to the jury that all fits together.
The defense gave pretty intense cross-examination and implied that this was a group of people of society that was not credible.
More so than any other case I ever handled, my crucial witnesses were very vulnerable to defense counsel because of their history.
For their life, why would you have your kids in a place like that?
If the defense was successful in discrediting all of these witnesses to the jury, our job was going to become almost impossible.
Das calls her key witness to the stand.
When the witness that was familiar with Cordarius testified, it was very obvious to everyone in the courtroom that she was terrified.
That side of town can be scary. I've lived over there. People that live in that lifestyle, you don't snitch.
In my direct examination, I asked the witness questions about things that she had admitted during her interview to police. And yet she would not admit those things. So we play her video in front of the defendant and his counsel. The jurors were not in the room. And she was shaking at times, looking over at the defendant.
After she watched the video, they brought us back in. She all of a sudden had answers to the previous questions she wouldn't say she knew before.
Only after being confronted with seeing that video was she willing to admit that she believed it was Cordarius Scott that was the shooter. And she told the truth. I wanted Jason White as my last witness. He was the lead detective on this case. He could tie up loose ends. He was attacked kind of in the same way that defense tried to discredit the other witnesses.
It's a tactic. They're little antics that they like to try to do to get under your skin.
It's interesting to contemplate as to how the jury reacts when someone like a homicide detective is being cross-examined in attack mode in the same way as the lay witnesses were.
The defense attorney was pretty intense on him, but he stayed solid on it.
The defense's argument was the Tulsa Police Department just rushed to judgment to get a suspect as soon as they could. That was offensive.
The jury goes out to deliberate. It's out of our hands. I am proud of the work we did in this case. Whether or not, they see the witnesses in this case to be credible or worthy,
We spent time just looking over the evidence. Let's get our hands on this stuff and look at it. We weren't in a rush to get out of there.
You got to wait it out and see what the jury is going to say.
After 3.5 hours of deliberation,
The jury found him guilty of murder in the first degree.
But I kind of was a little bit more pushy on giving him one last opportunity to make good choices in life.
The jury saw that our witnesses were worthy of being considered and being believed. Richard's family was very appreciative.
When they said guilty, it was the saddest moment for me. As sad as when Richard passed, because she too had lost a child, his mother. I forgave him, and if I could have set him free, I probably would have. That sounds crazy, doesn't it?
nearly 10 years after Richard's death.
I want us to make a difference.
Absolutely. Margaret honors his legacy with a local nonprofit.
We're trying to set up a village so that we can wrap around those kids. We want to work with children 16 to 25 who has had problems with the police, lead them to another level of life, a better life.
To get out here in the community and show them the skills that we've taught ourselves.
When Richard started having issues, I didn't know how to help my baby, but I gave him all I had to give.
It's the greatest thing we can give anybody, just to love them unconditionally.
You knew how to be a mother. And that's what people needed, and that is healing, so healing.
I can reach the children by just being there to say you're okay.
You telling the story right now, this is purpose. Now other people will know that there's an opportunity for them to change and be different.
Richard was a blessing in my life, but I can take his story and make a change in somebody else's life. I think he would say, thumbs up.
Texas 1991. Cold case cracked. Shocking arrest ends 35-year mystery. September 17th. Sill 1991. Arlington, Texas. A 25-year-old woman walked out of her home expecting to meet a client. She never came back. 5 days later, her body was found dumped on private property in a rural part of Johnson County. She had been shot multiple times. Her name was Cynthia Gonzalez. For 34 years, the case remained open. No arrest, no courtroom, no final answer. Then, in November 2025, detectives made a shocking arrest. But the story did not end there, because months later, a grand jury would refuse to indict the woman police had accused. And suddenly, the case that everyone thought had finally been solved was standing at the edge of another mystery. Cynthia Gonzalez disappeared on the evening of September 16th, Sill 1991. The next day, her ex-husband reported her missing. Investigators learned that Cynthia worked as an adult entertainer and had left her Arlington home to meet a client. That meeting was supposed to be routine. Instead, it became the last confirmed chapter of her life. Hours after she was reported missing, police found her vehicle abandoned in a neighborhood on the 900 block of Cedar Springs Terrace. The car was there. Cynthia was not. That was the first warning. A vehicle left behind. A woman gone. And no obvious explanation. Investigators immediately considered kidnapping. They began searching. They questioned people who knew Cynthia. They examined her relationships. They looked at her work. They followed every lead they could find. But in 1991, a missing woman could disappear into a gap that technology could not close. There were no smartphones, no GPS history, no digital location trail, no social media, no modern surveillance network. Investigators had witnesses, paper records, telephone calls, memory, and memory fades. For Cynthia's family, the waiting became unbearable. Every hour without information became another possibility. Maybe she was alive. Maybe she had left voluntarily. Maybe she was being held somewhere. Maybe she would suddenly walk through the door. Then September 22nd arrived. A body was found on private property in a rural area of Johnson County, off County Road 313. The woman had been shot multiple times. She had been there long enough for decomposition to begin. Investigators did not immediately know who she was. The body was unidentified. But fingerprints changed everything. The Tarrant County Medical Examiner's Office compared them. The result was devastating. The fingerprints belonged to Cynthia Gonzalez. The missing person investigation had become a homicide investigation. And the question changed. Where was Cynthia? Became. Who killed Cynthia? Detectives started over. They looked at the final hours. They examined the abandoned vehicle. They examined Cynthia's relationship. They questioned people around her. One name eventually began appearing again and again. Janie Perkins. In 1991, Perkins was Cynthia's friend. The two women spent time together. But investigators discovered another connection. They shared a romantic partner. And several weeks before Cynthia's disappearance, that man had told Perkins that he was ending their relationship with her and choosing Cynthia instead. That detail changed the emotional landscape of the investigation. There was jealousy. There was rejection. There was a friendship suddenly placed under pressure. And there was a woman who, according to investigators, had strong feelings about the breakup. Perkins became a person of interest. But suspicion was not enough. Police questioned her. They asked where she had been on the night Cynthia disappeared. She could not provide an alibi investigators could verify. Then detectives asked another question. Did she know who killed Cynthia? Perkins said no. Did she kill Cynthia? Again, no. She voluntarily took a polygraph examination. She failed. Investigators administered another. Again, the result indicated deception. But a polygraph was not enough, and it was not admissible as proof of guilt. Perkins remained free. She denied involvement. The case continued. Detectives believed she knew more than she was saying. But believing something and proving it are two very different things. The investigation went cold. Years became decades. The people who had worked the original case aged. Some retired. Some died. Witnesses moved away. Memories became uncertain. Documents became old. And Cynthia's name became another entry in a cold case archive. The case was never officially closed, but it was no longer moving. Then, decades later, something unexpected happened. Not a DNA match. Not a confession. Not a new weapon. Not a hidden fingerprint. A classroom. In 2025, the University of Texas at Arlington launched an advanced criminology and criminal justice course in partnership with the Arlington Police Department. Selected students were given access to real cold case files. They were not given physical evidence. They were given reports, documents, interviews, old investigative material. 3 cold cases were selected. One of them was Cynthia Gonzalez. The students began reading. They read the same reports detectives had read decades earlier. They saw the same names, the same contradictions, the same unanswered questions. But they had something the original investigators did not have: distance. They were not emotionally trapped inside the 1991 investigation. They could look at the file as a whole. And one name kept pulling their attention: Janie Perkins. Why had she never been charged? Why had she failed to voluntary polygraph examination? Why had she been unable to provide a clear alibi? Why had investigators documented statements suggesting she was glad Cynthia was dead? And why had the case remained unresolved despite so many of those warning signs? The students started asking questions. The questions went back to Arlington homicide detective. The detectives began digging again. The old file opened. New eyes entered. Old statements were compared. Names were checked. Witnesses were reconsidered. And then investigators found something that changed the case. Witnesses had allegedly come forward years earlier claiming Perkins had admitted involvement. Not vague admissions. Specific details. Details investigators said were consistent with evidence from the crime. Details that suggested she knew more than someone uninvolved should have known. Police began comparing those statements against the physical evidence and the original investigation. The pieces began aligning. Investigators believed Perkins may have participated in or facilitated Cynthia's kidnapping and murder. The case suddenly moved. After more than 3 decades of silence, detectives had a suspect. Not a stranger. Not someone who had vanished. Someone who had been in the original investigation. Someone whose name had appeared decades earlier. Someone who had been questioned. Someone who had remained free. On November 6th, SIL 2025, the U.S. Marshals North Texas Fugitive Task Force located Janie Perkins in AZLE, Texas. She was 63 years old. The arrest was made without incident. The woman once questioned about Cynthia Gonzalez in 1991 was now under arrest for capital murder. The headline spread quickly. A Texas cold case had cracked. 34 years of silence had apparently ended. But the arrest raised another question. What had investigators found this time that they had missed before? The answer was not one piece of evidence. It was the accumulation. Old witness statements. Earlier statements attributed to Perkins. The absence of a convincing alibi. Her relationship with Cynthia. The romantic triangle. The alleged admissions. And the comparison of those statements with the known facts of the murder. Police believed the evidence showed Perkins had either participated in the kidnapping and murder or helped facilitate it. For Cynthia's family, the arrest was enormous. For decades, there had been no name to attach to the crime, no person to confront, no arrest photograph, no courtroom. Then suddenly there was one. But an arrest is not a conviction, and the legal system still had another test waiting. A grand jury. The case would have to survive scrutiny. The evidence would have to be enough. The allegations would have to become a charge capable of moving forward. And that is where the story took another unexpected turn. March 2026. A Tarrant County grand jury reviewed the case. The result was not an indictment. It was a no bill. The grand jury declined to indict Perkins. The capital murder case did not move forward. The arrest that had shocked Texas did not become a prosecution. Perkins maintained she was not involved. Her family expressed gratitude for the grand jury's decision. And suddenly, the phrase solved became complicated. Because the police investigation had reached one conclusion. The grand jury reached another. Cynthia Gonzalez was still dead. The location where her body was found was still real. The 1991 evidence was still there. The witnesses were still part of the record. The old statements still existed. But legally, the case remained without a conviction. The cold case had cracked. Then it closed again. And that is what makes the Cynthia Gonzalez investigation so haunting. The mystery is not simply about who disappeared. It is about how a case can survive for more than 3 decades, suddenly explode back into the public eye, produce an arrest, and still leave the central question unanswered. Who killed Cynthia Gonzalez? Investigators once believed the answer was Janie Perkins. They said the old evidence pointed toward her. They said witnesses had reported admission. They said details allegedly known to Perkins matched the evidence. But a grand jury did not indict her. That means the final legal answer remains unresolved. For Cynthia's daughter, the decades have never been just dates. September 16th, SIL 1991. The last night her mother was known to be alive. September 17th. The missing person report. September 22nd. The discovery of the body. November 6th, 2025. The arrest. March 20th, SIL 2026. The no bill. Each date is another mark on a timeline that refuses to end. And somewhere inside that timeline is the missing moment. The moment Cynthia left her home. The moment she entered a vehicle or met someone. The moment her life changed. The moment the killer decided she would not return. Those minutes are gone. But the evidence remains. The abandoned vehicle. The rural road. The gunshots. The old interviews. The alleged confessions. The failed polygraphs. The relationship that investigators believed created a motive. The students who reopened questions detectives had stopped asking. And the arrest that briefly made the world believe the mystery was over. It was not. Because a cold case is not truly solved by a headline. It is solved when the evidence survives every question, every challenge, every courtroom, every doubt. Cynthia Gonzalez never received that final answer. Her family came closer to one in 2025 than they had in decades. But the grand jury's decision in 2026 left the case hanging in the same darkness that had surrounded it since 1991. 35 years of questions. One shocking arrest. One unexpected legal reversal. And a murder that still refuses to disappear. The road in Johnson County is quieter now. The world around it has changed. But the question remains. Who took Cynthia Gonzalez from Arlington in September 1991? Who drove her away? Who fired the shots? And who, after all these years, still knows the truth? The case was once buried in a box. Then a classroom opened it. 15 students began reading. A forgotten name surfaced. Detectives looked again. A woman was arrested. And for one brief moment, a family believed the nightmare might finally have an end date. Then the grand jury said no, and the silence returned. But Cynthia's name is no longer buried. The file is open. The questions are alive. And somewhere inside those old pages may still be the detail that changes everything. Because sometimes a cold case does not end with an arrest. Sometimes the arrest is only the moment the real mystery begins. The file had been sitting there for years. Not forgotten. Not officially closed. Just waiting. A name. A photograph. A missing person report from September 1991. And a homicide investigation that had never produced an arrest. Cynthia Gonzalez was 25 years old when she disappeared. She lived in Arlington, Texas. On the evening of September 16th, still 1991, she left her home to meet a client. That was the last confirmed sighting of her alive. The next day, her ex-husband reported her missing. At first, investigators did not know what they were dealing with. A missing woman, an abandoned vehicle, an unexplained absence. Maybe Cynthia had left voluntarily. Maybe something had happened on the road. Maybe someone had taken her. The possibilities were endless. And in 1991, investigators had far fewer ways to eliminate them. There was no smartphone to track, no GPS history, no digital payment trail, no social media posts showing where someone had been. There was only the evidence left behind. And Cynthia's car was one of the first pieces. It was found abandoned in a neighborhood on the 900 block of Cedar Springs Terrace. Cynthia was nowhere nearby. Her vehicle was there. She was not. That discovery changed the urgency of the search. Police began considering the possibility that she had been kidnapped. Officers searched. Detectives questioned people. They followed leads, but the clock was already moving. Every hour mattered. Every missing hour made the reconstruction harder. Then came September 22nd. 5 days after Cynthia was reported missing, a body was discovered on private property in a rural area of Johnson County, off County Road 313. The woman had been shot multiple times. Her body was decomposing. At first, investigators did not know her identity. There was no immediate answer. No family waiting at the scene. No name attached to the body. Just another unidentified victim. Then the fingerprints were compared. The Tarrant County Medical Examiner's Office made the identification. Cynthia Gonzalez. The missing person case was over, but the murder investigation had just begun. Her family had spent days hoping she might still be alive. Now they had an answer. The worst possible answer. Cynthia was dead, and someone had killed her. The investigators now had to reconstruct a life that had ended somewhere between Arlington and that isolated stretch of Johnson County. They needed to know where she had gone, who she had met, who had spoken to her, who had seen her, and most importantly, who had a reason to want her dead. The case generated leads. Investigators looked at people connected to Cynthia. They looked at her work. They looked at her personal relationship. They examined the circumstances surrounding her disappearance. And eventually, attention turned towards someone who was not a stranger, Janie Perkins. Perkins had been Cynthia's friend. The two women frequently spent time together. From the outside, there was nothing immediately extraordinary about the relationship, but investigators discovered a complication. The two women shared a romantic partner, and several weeks before Cynthia's murder, that man told Perkins he was ending their relationship with her. He was choosing Cynthia. That detail became important, because suddenly there was a possible emotional conflict, friendship, jealousy, rejection, and a relationship that had changed shortly before Cynthia disappeared. Investigators began looking more closely at Perkins. Where was she the night Cynthia vanished? Could she account for her movements? Was there anyone who could confirm where she had been? According to Arlington police, Perkins could not provide the original investigators with an alibi for the night Cynthia went missing. That did not prove she had committed a crime, but it kept her in the investigators' attention. Then came the polygraph examination. Perkins voluntarily took one. Investigators asked whether she knew who killed Cynthia. She failed. She took another. Again, investigators interpreted the results as deceptive, but there was a critical limitation. A polygraph is not proof of guilt. It cannot tell investigators with certainty whether someone committed a murder, and it cannot replace physical evidence. Perkins maintained she was not involved. She was never charged. The case continued without an arrest. Years passed. The investigation remained alive, but it did not move toward a resolution. The witnesses aged. Memories became less reliable. Some people disappeared from the area. Others died. The investigators who had worked the case in the 1990s eventually moved on, and Cynthia's murder became one of those cases that seemed permanently trapped in the past. The file remained. The questions remained. But the breakthrough did not come. Then something changed in 2024. The case was assigned to a current Arlington homicide detective for review. The detective initially believed there was no new evidence and no obvious new led to pursuit. That might have been the end of it. Another review. Another cold file. Another case without an answer. But the detective agreed to keep the investigation open. That decision became important because in 2025, Arlington police entered into an unusual partnership with the University of Texas at Arlington. The idea was simple. Give selected criminology and criminal justice students access to real cold case files. Let them examine the reports. Let them identify inconsistency. Let them ask questions. Let them search for investigative paths that might have been overlooked decades earlier. It was not a television show. It was not a reenactment. The students were working with actual case materials provided by the department. Physical evidence was excluded, but they could review reports and investigative documents. Cynthia Gonzalez's case was one of 3 selected. The students began reading, page after page, report after report, witness statement after witness statement. 34 years of investigation compressed into a case file. They were not there in 1991. They had not watched Cynthia disappear. They had not stood beside the abandoned vehicle. They had not walked the rural property where her body was found. They had no personal connection to the original assumption. That distance mattered. They could ask questions without being trapped by the expectations of the original investigation. And one question kept returning. Why Janie Perkins? The students began examining her role. They looked at the relationship between Perkins and Cynthia. They looked at the shared romantic partner. They looked at the timing of the breakup. They looked at the lack of a verified alibi. They looked at the polygraph results. And they looked at statements attributed to Perkins during the original investigation. According to Arlington police, Perkins had made statements indicating she was glad Cynthia was dead. Police also said she had spoken about having considered killing Cynthia or having someone else kill her. Those allegations were already in the historical case material. But the students began asking whether there was more. Did anyone ever claim Perkins had admitted involvement? Were there witnesses who had told police something that had not received enough attention? Had those statements been compared carefully with the physical facts of the murder? The questions went back to the homicide detective. And this time, the detectives looked again. They began reviewing the case with fresh eyes. They examined witness statements. They compared old accounts against the evidence. They looked for information that might have been overlooked. And they found witnesses who had claimed Perkins admitted involvement in the murder. According to police, those witnesses provided specific details about the killing. That was different. A general accusation was one thing. A specific statement was another. If someone claimed Perkins had told them details that only someone involved could reasonably know, investigators had to examine those details. They compared the statements against the known evidence. According to Arlington police, the accounts aligned. That did not automatically establish guilt, but it gave detectives something they had not had before, a reason to move. The cold case was no longer simply a historical investigation. It was active again. Detectives went back through the evidence. They revisited the relationship. They revisited the old statements. They revisited the circumstances surrounding Cynthia's disappearance. And the more they examined the material, the more convinced they became that Perkins had been involved. Police ultimately said they believed she either participated in or facilitated Cynthia's kidnapping and murder. That distinction mattered. The investigators were not simply claiming she had been present at the moment Cynthia was killed. They believed her involvement could have taken different forms: participation, facilitation, planning, connection. The evidence had to establish the role, and now detectives had to decide whether it was strong enough to support criminal charges. They consulted the Tarrant County District Attorney's Office. Then the decision was made. An arrest warrant was obtained. 1 count: capital murder. The case that had begun in 1991 was suddenly moving toward an arrest. But Cynthia's story had never been about one suspect alone. It had been about time. 34 years of time. 34 years since she walked out of her Arlington home. 34 years since someone last saw her alive. 34 years since her vehicle was abandoned. 34 years since her body was found. 34 years of unanswered questions. And now, the woman who had been investigated decades earlier was once again at the center of the case. The arrest did not happen in Arlington. On November 6th, SIL 2025, members of the U.S. Marshals North Texas Fugitive Task Force located Janie Perkins in AZLE, Texas. She was 63 years old. Decades had passed since Cynthia disappeared. Perkins was taken into custody without incident. The arrest was the moment the cold case became national news. A case that had survived for more than 3 decades had suddenly produced a suspect, a name, a booking, a charge, capital murder. For Cynthia's family, the moment carried a weight that no headline could fully describe, because for years the case had been suspended between memory and uncertainty. Now there was movement. Now investigators were saying they believed they had found the person responsible. Now the family could finally hear the name of someone accused in connection with Cynthia's death. But an arrest is not a conviction, and the case was far from over. The evidence that had convinced investigators still had to face another test: the legal system, the prosecution, the scrutiny of a grand jury, and the defense of the woman who had spent more than 3 decades denying involvement. Perkins had maintained she was not involved. She had never been charged in 1991. She had lived through the investigation. She had watched the years pass. And now, at 63, she was facing a capital murder accusation tied to a woman who had disappeared when Perkins herself was still young. The case had crossed generations. The original detectives were no longer the same people. The technology had changed. The city had changed. The witnesses had changed. Even the investigators' understanding of cold cases had changed. But the central question had not. Who killed Cynthia Gonzalez? The police believed they had an answer. The students believed there were questions worth asking again. The old witnesses had provided statements. The detectives had found connection. The district attorney's office had been consulted, and an arrest had finally been made. But the most important part of the case was still waiting. Could the evidence survive? Could the accusations be proven? Could the story investigators had reconstructed withstand the scrutiny of a courtroom? For the first time since 1991, Cynthia's murder was no longer sitting quietly in an archive. It was moving. And everyone involved knew that one decision could determine whether 34 years of mystery would finally become justice, or whether the case would return to the darkness from which it had emerged. The answer would come months later. And when it did, it would shock the same people who had celebrated the arrest, because the cold case that had finally cracked was about to become a different kind of mystery. The arrest had given the case a fate, but it had not yet given Cynthia Gonzalez the final answer. The arrest had happened. The headlines had appeared. For the first time in 34 years, the name of a suspect was attached to Cynthia Gonzalez's murder. But behind the headline was a much older story. A story that began in Arlington in 1991. A story built from missing hours, unanswered questions, old interviews, and a relationship that investigators had never completely forgotten. Because Janie Perkins was not a stranger who suddenly appeared in the case decades later. Her name had been there from the beginning. That was what made the new investigation so unsettling. The woman arrested in 2025 had already been known to detectives in the 1990s. She had already been questioned. She had already been considered suspicious. And yet, for more than 3 decades, nothing happened. No indictment. No trial. No conviction. Only a file that grew older. The original investigators had followed numerous leads, but the case never produced an arrest. That meant the new detectives were not starting with an empty page. They were reopening a book that had already been read. The difference was that they were reading it again. And sometimes, that is where a cold case changes. Not because the evidence suddenly appeared, because someone finally notices what the old evidence was saying. Cynthia had been 25. Her life had been interrupted in a single night. She had left her Arlington home on September 16th, SIL 1991. She was going to meet a client. There was nothing in that decision that should have suggested she would never return. But she did not return. The next day, her ex-husband reported her missing. A few hours later, her vehicle was discovered abandoned. That vehicle became one of the first major facts in the investigation. It had not simply disappeared with Cynthia. It had been left behind. Police found it in a neighborhood on the 900 block of Cedar Springs Terrace. The car was there. Cynthia was somewhere else, and investigators had no immediate explanation. The possibility of kidnapping was considered. Then came the discovery in Johnson County. 5 days after Cynthia disappeared, an unknown woman's body was found on private property off County Road 313. She had been shot multiple times. Her body was already decomposing. The investigators had a homicide, but they did not yet have a name. Then the fingerprints gave them one. Cynthia Gonzalez. The search for a missing woman became the investigation of her death, and the people closest to Cynthia became part of the investigation. Friends, acquaintances, people connected to her work, people connected to her personal life, people who had spoken to her before she disappeared. Among those people was Janie Perkins. Perkins had been Cynthia's friend. According to Arlington police, the two women frequently spent time together. But there was another connection. They shared a romantic partner, and that relationship had changed shortly before Cynthia's disappearance. The man had told Perkins he was ending things with her. He wanted to be with Cynthia. That was one of the most important pieces of the original investigation, not because jealousy proves murder. It does not. But because investigators had to understand the relationship surrounding Cynthia in the weeks before her death. Something had changed. Someone had been rejected. Someone else had been chosen. And Cynthia was at the center of that conflict. Police questioned Perkins. According to investigators, she could not provide an alibi for the night Cynthia disappeared. That did not establish where she had been. It simply meant investigators could not verify her whereabouts. Then came the polygraph examination. Perkins voluntarily took two. She was asked whether she knew who killed Cynthia. She was asked whether she had killed Cynthia. Police said she failed both examinations. But there is an important distinction. A polygraph result is not a conviction. It is not a fingerprint. It is not DNA. It is not a video recording. And it was not enough to bring charges. Perkins maintained that she had nothing to do with Cynthia's murder. The investigation continued, and the case became colder. Years passed. The 1990s became the 2000s. The 2000s became the 2010. The 2010s became the 2020s. Cynthia's murder remained unresolved. The original investigators had pursued leads, but no arrest came. No suspect was formally charged. The case remained a homicide without a courtroom. Then, in 2024, the case was assigned to a current Arlington homicide detective for review. The department did not have a full-time cold case unit. Unsolved murders were handled by homicide detectives between active cases. That meant cold cases had to compete with current emergencies. New murders, new victims, new suspects, new evidence. A case from 1991 could wait while a case from yesterday demanded attention. When the detective first reviewed Cynthia's file, the initial conclusion was discouraging. There appeared to be no obvious new evidence, no obvious new lead. Nothing that immediately suggested the decades-old investigation was about to change, but the detective agreed to keep the case open. That decision mattered, because the following year, Arlington police began something unusual, a partnership with the University of Texas at Arlington. The Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice launched an advanced course that allowed selected students to review real Arlington Police Department cold cases. The goal was not entertainment. The students were not solving fictional crime. They were looking at real investigative material. Reports, documents, statements, the history of cases that had never reached a final resolution. They could not review physical evidence, but they could examine the reports and materials contained in the file. Cynthia's case was one of 3 selected. The students began reading, and somewhere inside those old reports was a name that had already appeared decades earlier, Janie Perkins. The students began asking questions. Why had investigators focused on her? What had been known about her relationship with Cynthia? What happened between the two women? What did the original investigators know? What had Perkins told them? And what had other people told investigators about Perkins? The questions did not immediately solve anything, but they changed the direction of the review. The students communicated with homicide detectives throughout the semester. The detectives listened. Then they began researching Perkins again. This time, the investigation was not limited to the assumptions of 1991. The detectives had the advantage of decades of hindsight. They could compare old statements. They could reconsider old information. They could look at witnesses who had previously been interviewed, and they discovered something significant. Witnesses had come forward claiming Perkins had admitted involvement in Cynthia's murder. According to Arlington police, those witnesses provided specific details about the killing, details that investigators believed were consistent with evidence already contained in the case. That was the turning point, because now there were allegations of admission, not simply rumors, not simply suspicion. Witnesses saying that Perkins had told them she was involved. Detectives compared those accounts against the existing evidence. According to police, the details aligned. The old investigation suddenly looked different. A woman once considered suspicious was now at the center of a renewed case, and the detectives had to ask the question that had been waiting since 1991. Was there enough evidence to charge her? They consulted with the Tarrant County District Attorney's office. The case moved forward. A warrant was obtained, and on November 6th, SIL 2025, the U.S. Marshals North Texas Fugitive Task Force located Perkins in AZLE, Texas. She was 63 years old. 34 years had passed since Cynthia disappeared. 34 years between the original investigation and the arrest. The woman who had once been questioned as part of the investigation was now being taken into custody on a capital murder charge. The arrest was made without incident. Suddenly, the old case was everywhere. The photographs returned. Cynthia's name returned. The date returned. September 1991. The rural property. The abandoned vehicle. The woman who disappeared. The woman who was arrested. The headlines made it sound simple. A cold case had cracked. A suspect had finally been arrested. A mystery that had lasted decades appeared to have an answer. But the reality was more complicated. An arrest is an accusation. It is not a verdict. And the case still had to survive the legal process. For Perkins, the accusation was devastating. She had spent more than 3 decades living under a suspicion that had never resulted in charges. Now she was 63. The original murder had become ancient history to most people, but for her, the investigation had suddenly returned. The past was no longer past. It was waiting in a courtroom. And for Cynthia's family, the arrest brought another kind of shock. For years, there had been no person to point toward. No arrest. No formal accusation. No courtroom date. Now there was movement. But movement is not closure. The family still needed answers. What happened to Cynthia after she left her home? Who took her? Why was her vehicle abandoned? How did she end up in rural Johnson County? Who was with her? Who knew what happened? And what exactly did the witnesses claim Perkins had told them? Those questions became central to the case, because the prosecution would need more than a compelling story. It would need evidence that could survive the standard of proof required for a criminal conviction. The investigators believed the evidence was sufficient to justify the arrest. The arrest itself demonstrated that they believed the case had moved beyond mere suspicion. But the legal system would examine the case differently. The defense would challenge the evidence. The allegations would be scrutinized. Witness memories would be questioned. Statements made decades earlier would be examined. And the passage of time would become one of the greatest obstacles. 34 years is an enormous amount of time. People forget. People move. People die. People become unable to testify. Documents disappear. Memories change. And evidence that might have been powerful in 1991 can become difficult to present decades later. That is the brutal reality of cold cases. Time does not simply make a mystery older. It can make justice harder to prove. And Cynthia's case was about to demonstrate that reality in a way nobody expected. The arrest had created the impression that the mystery was over, but the arrest was actually the beginning of the final test. Could the evidence withstand independent review? Could the allegations become admissible evidence? Could the old witnesses still support the case? Could prosecutors prove beyond a reasonable doubt what happened in 1991? Those questions were no longer theoretical. They were about to become the center of the case. And there was another complication. The public had already heard the story. Police had announced the arrest. The connection to the Utah students had become national news. The phrase cold case solved spread quickly. But inside the legal system, nothing was solved yet. The defendant was still presumed innocent. The evidence had not been tested at trial, and Cynthia's murder had not been legally resolved. The case now moved toward a grand jury. That process would determine whether the capital murder accusation could proceed. For investigators, it was the moment they had spent decades waiting for. For Cynthia's family, it was another painful period of waiting. For Perkins, it was the moment when an accusation that had followed her for decades would finally face formal scrutiny. The entire investigation had reached a narrow doorway. On one side was 34 years of police work. On the other was the possibility of prosecution. Between them was the evidence. And that evidence would have to speak for itself. Then came March 2026. The grand jury reviewed the case. And the decision was not what the headlines had predicted. No bill. No indictment. No criminal charge moving forward from that grand jury. The case that had appeared solved suddenly stood open again. The arrest remained part of the history. The accusations remained part of the investigation. But there would be no trial based on that presentation. The development stunned anyone who had believed the arrest marked the end. It did not. It marked another turning point. The Tarrant County grand jury had declined to indict Perkins. Her attorney said the decision reflected an independent assessment of the evidence and that the allegations did not warrant criminal charges. The district attorney's office described the outcome as a difficult reality of cold cases. Witnesses can die. Witnesses can become unavailable. Old cases often lack the modern technological evidence available today. There may be no cell phone record, no surveillance footage, no digital trail. And even when investigators believe they know what happened, belief is not enough. The evidence must be admissible. It must be reliable. It must be strong enough to survive reasonable doubt. That is the difference between suspicion and prosecution, between an arrest and a conviction, between a cold case headline and justice. And Cynthia Gonzalez remained at the center of all of it. She was 25 when she disappeared. She should have grown older. She should have turned 30, then 40, then 50, then 60. Instead, the years passed without her. Her family aged. The investigators aged. The witnesses aged. The city changed. But Cynthia remained 25 forever. And the place where her body was found remained part of the case history. A rural property. County Road 313. A location that most people in Arlington would never have connected to the disappearance of a young woman from their city. But that connection became permanent on September 22nd, SIL 1991. The discovery there changed everything. It transformed a missing person report into a murder investigation. It created a question that survived for decades. And eventually, that question reached a university classroom. Students opened the files. They saw a name. They asked why. Detectives listened. The old case was examined again. And the name Janie Perkins returned to the center of the investigation. An arrest followed. Then a grand jury. Then a no bill. And now the case is suspended between two realities. The police investigation says the evidence led them to Perkins. The grand jury did not find enough to indict her. Neither event changes the fact that Cynthia Gonzalez was murdered. Neither event explains exactly what happened to her. And neither event tells her family who, beyond reasonable doubt, was responsible. That is why the case remains haunting. Not because nothing happened, but because so much happened. A woman disappeared. Her car was abandoned. Her body was found days later. A suspect was investigated. Witnesses later came forward. A university class reopened the file. A suspect was arrested. And then the legal system stopped the case from moving forward. 34 years of silence produced one of the most dramatic cold case developments imaginable. Then the courtroom door closed again. But the investigation itself may not be finished. Authorities have indicated they hope additional information could eventually support an indictment. The file remains. The questions remain. And Cynthia's name remains attached to one of the most extraordinary cold case investigations in Texas. Because sometimes the most frightening part of a cold case is not that investigators have no suspect. It is that they may have had a suspect for decades and still could not prove what happened. The night Cynthia Gonzalez disappeared remains trapped in 1991. A client meeting, an abandoned vehicle, a missing woman, a rural road, 5 days of uncertainty, then a body. The investigation followed. Years followed the investigation, and decades followed the years. But the truth never arrived in court. Not yet. The last chapter was supposed to be the arrest. Instead, the arrest became another unanswered question. And somewhere inside the original reports, the witness statements, the old interviews, and the evidence from 1991, may still be the piece that investigators need, the piece that could transform suspicion into proof, the piece that could finally explain how Cynthia Gonzalez went from a 25-year-old woman leaving her Arlington home to a homicide victim found miles away. Until that piece appears, the case remains what it has always been. A cold case, a name, a photograph, a family waiting, and a question that has survived for more than 3 decades. Who killed Cynthia Gonzalez? The answer was almost there. Then it disappeared again. The arrest had changed everything. For 34 years, Cynthia Gonzalez had existed in the coldest part of the criminal justice system. Her name was in a file. Her photograph was in a file. The date of her disappearance was in a file. The location where her body was discovered was in a file. And every year that passed added another layer of distance between the murder and the people still trying to understand it. Then Janie Perkins was arrested. For a brief moment, the distance disappeared. The case was suddenly alive again. The woman investigators had focused on in 1991 was once again at the center of the investigation. But the arrest did not erase the years between. It made those years more important, because every statement from the original investigation now had to be examined through a different lens. What did investigators know in 1991? What did they believe? What did they miss? And what information had appeared only after the case became cold? Those questions mattered because the murder had happened in a different era. There were no smartphones, no digital location record, no social media, no modern surveillance network following people through a city. The investigation depended heavily on human memory, and memory is fragile. A witness can remember a face but forget a time. A person can remember a conversation but confuse the year. Someone can remember what they believed happened rather than what actually happened. 34 years magnifies that problem. By the time detectives returned to the case, many of the people who had been young adults in 1991 were elderly. Some had died. Some could no longer be located. Some could remember only fragments. And some had spent decades carrying their own version of that night. That was the landscape investigators entered when they reopened Cynthia's case. The first task was not to invent a new theory. It was to understand the old one. Cynthia had disappeared after leaving her Arlington home to meet a client. She was 25. Her ex-husband reported her missing the following day. Her vehicle was found abandoned on the 900 block of Cedar Springs Terrace. 5 days later, a woman's body was discovered on private property in rural Johnson County, off County Road 313. The victim had been shot multiple times. Fingerprint identification confirmed what the family had feared. It was Cynthia. That sequence was established. The mystery began in the space between those events. What happened after Cynthia left? Who did she meet? How did she get from Arlington to Johnson County? Why was her vehicle abandoned? Who was responsible for the shooting? Those questions became the backbone of the original investigation. Detectives examined Cynthia's personal life. They looked at the people around her. And Janie Perkins became significant because of the relationship between the two women. They were friends. They spent time together. But they also shared a romantic partner. That relationship had changed shortly before Cynthia's disappearance. The man had told Perkins he wanted to end their relationship and be with Cynthia. For investigators, that created a possible motive. But motive is only one piece of a homicide investigation. Someone can be angry without becoming violent. Someone can feel betrayed without committing murder. Someone can be jealous without ever harming the person they resent. Investigators therefore needed something more. They questioned Perkins. According to Arlington police, she could not provide an alibi for the night Cynthia disappeared. Again, that was suspicious. But suspicion is not proof. Police also said Perkins voluntarily took to polygraph examination. Investigators interpreted both as deceptive. But even that did not produce a criminal charge. The case remained unresolved. That fact is easy to overlook when looking backward. People see the later arrest and assume investigators simply ignored an obvious suspect. But cold cases rarely work that way. A suspect can appear suspicious for years without prosecutors believing the available evidence can support a conviction. A detective can believe someone is responsible. A family can believe someone is responsible. A community can believe someone is responsible. None of those beliefs are enough. The evidence has to survive. And in 1991, the evidence did not carry the case forward, so the file remained. Then time began doing what time always does. It erased context. People moved. Jobs changed. Relationships ended. Addresses disappeared. Memories weakened. And Cynthia's murder became something people in Arlington remembered in fragments. A young woman. A missing car. A body found in Johnson County. A friend who had been questioned. A case that never reached a courtroom. For Cynthia's family, however, there was no back then. There was only the absence. The unanswered phone call. The empty space where a daughter should have been. The birthday that came without her. The holidays that came without her. The years that kept moving while Cynthia remained 25. That is the part of a cold case that never becomes cold for a family. The police file can sit untouched. The family cannot. Then came 2024. The Arlington Police Department assigned the case to a current homicide detective for review. At first, the review appeared unlikely to produce a breakthrough. There was no obvious new evidence. No dramatic forensic discovery waiting in a laboratory. No anonymous confession arriving at headquarters. The detective simply began reading. That may sound insignificant. It was not, because every cold case begins again with someone willing to read the old material as if the answer might still be there. And in 2025, the department created another opportunity to look at the case. The University of Texas at Arlington became involved through a partnership with Arlington Police. Students in an advanced criminology and criminal justice course were given access to selected cold case files. Cynthia's was one of them. They could not examine physical evidence, but they could examine reports and investigative material. They could see the chronology. They could read the interviews. They could compare statements. They could ask questions. And they did. The students were not burdened by the assumptions of 1991. They did not have to defend the decisions of the original detective. They did not have to explain why a particular lead had been rejected decades earlier. They could simply ask, what if? What if this witness was more important than investigators realized? What if this statement was interpreted incorrectly? What if the relationship between Cynthia and Perkins meant more than investigators had understood? What if someone who had been interviewed in 1991 knew more than they admitted? The students focused attention on Perkins. That did not mean they had solved the murder. It meant they had found a line of inquiry worth pursuing. The detectives took that work seriously. They reopened old questions. They examined statements. They contacted witnesses. And according to Arlington Police, they uncovered witnesses who said Perkins had admitted involvement in Cynthia's murder. That was a major development. The investigation now had a new layer. These were not simply statements from 1991. They were accounts that investigators were able to revisit decades later. Police said the witnesses provided specific details that investigators believed aligned with known evidence. That alignment became central to the renewed investigation. But there was still a problem. Every statement had to be evaluated. Every witness had to be questioned. Every recollection had to be tested. And the passage of time could not be ignored. A witness saying something in 2025 about a conversation that allegedly happened years earlier is different from a witness reporting it immediately after the crime. Memory changes. People forget. People reinterpret. People sometimes become more certain as time passes, even when their original memory was uncertain. That is why the detectives needed corroboration. They needed the old evidence to connect with the new information. They needed to know whether the details described by the witnesses were consistent with the physical facts already documented in the file. According to police, they were. The detectives believed the new review had strengthened the case enough to move forward. They consulted the Tarrant County District Attorney's office. Then came the decision. An arrest warrant. Capital murder. The case had crossed a line. The suspect who had once been questioned was now accused. On November 6, SIL 2025, the U.S. Marshals North Texas Fugitive Task Force located Janie Perkins in AZLE, Texas. She was 63. The woman arrested was not the woman investigators remembered from 1991. Decades had changed her, but the accusation was tied to the same night, the same woman, the same murder, the same unanswered questions. Perkins was arrested without incident, and immediately the story became bigger than the case file. A Texas cold case had produced an arrest. 34 years after Cynthia disappeared, someone was finally facing a capital murder accusation. But behind the dramatic headline was a complicated legal reality. An arrest does not establish guilt. It establishes that law enforcement believes there is probable cause to accuse someone of a crime. The prosecution still has to prove its case, and a defendant remains presumed innocent. That distinction would soon become critical, because the case was heading toward a grand jury. The evidence would be reviewed. The allegations would be tested. The witnesses would matter. The old records would matter. And the passage of time would matter. For Cynthia's family, this was another period of uncertainty. They had already waited 34 years. Now they had to wait again. For investigators, it was a different kind of pressure. They had announced an arrest. They had publicly described the case as the result of renewed investigative work. Now the evidence had to support the next stage. The police department had to stand behind the investigation. The prosecutors had to evaluate what could actually be presented. And the grand jury had to decide whether the case should proceed. The case was no longer just about what detectives believed. It was about what could be proven. That difference became the center of everything. Meanwhile, Cynthia's name continued to surface in public report. Her age, her photograph, her disappearance, her abandoned vehicle, the rural location where she was found. Each detail returned to the public consciousness. People who had never heard of Cynthia in 1991 suddenly learned her name in 2025. People who had lived through the original investigation remembered it again, and people who had been children at the time were now adult. The case had crossed generations, but the central facts remained unchanged. Cynthia left home. She did not return. Her vehicle was abandoned. Her body was discovered 5 days later. She had been shot multiple times. No one was convicted. Then, decades later, a woman was arrested. The story seemed to be approaching an ending. But there was one more stage, the grand jury. That stage would determine whether the arrest could become a prosecution. And that meant the evidence collected over decades would have to speak clearly. Not emotionally, not dramatically, not through headlines, through evidence. The defense would have its own questions. How reliable were the witnesses? How much time had passed? Were the alleged admissions documented when they supposedly occurred? Could the prosecution establish exactly what Perkins did? Could the evidence connect her to the murder beyond reasonable doubt? Those questions were waiting. And they would not disappear simply because the arrest had happened. The case had spent decades surviving without a defendant. Now it had to survive with one. That is a completely different challenge. The police had to show that the investigation was strong enough to justify the accusation. The prosecutors had to determine whether the available evidence could withstand legal scrutiny. And the grand jury had to decide whether there was sufficient cause to indict. For the first time since 1991, Cynthia's murder was moving toward that moment. The silence was ending, or at least it appeared to be. The old case file had been reopened. A suspect had been arrested. Witnesses had been re-examined. Students had helped investigators look at the evidence from a different angle. A decades-old mystery had suddenly become a living criminal case. But one fact remained impossible to escape. 34 years had passed, and every year had taken something away. A witness, a memory, a document, a piece of evidence, a chance to ask someone a question while they were still alive. That is the cruelty of time in a homicide investigation. The truth does not become stronger simply because people wait longer. Sometimes the truth becomes harder to prove. Sometimes the person who knows the answer dies. Sometimes the evidence disappears. Sometimes a case reaches the courtroom only to discover that the past cannot be reconstructed with the certainty required by law. And Cynthia's case was approaching exactly that test. The arrest had created hope, but hope was not evidence. The headlines had created certainty, but headlines were not verdicts. The investigators believed they had found the person responsible, but belief was not conviction. Everything now depended on what the grand jury saw. And while the public waited, the case returned to the same question that had haunted investigators since 1991. What happened to Cynthia Gonzalez after she left Arlington? The answer was still hidden somewhere inside those 34 years. Maybe in an old statement. Maybe in a forgotten memory. Maybe in a conversation that someone had never reported. Maybe in a detail that had seemed meaningless in 1991 but looked different decades later. The cold case had moved, but it had not ended. And as the grand jury date approached, everyone connected to the case was waiting for the same thing. A decision. Not another theory. Not another headline. Not another name added to an old file. A decision that would determine whether Cynthia's murder would finally move toward a courtroom. The evidence had survived 34 years. Now it had to survive the law. The evidence had survived 34 years. Now it had to survive the law. That was the reality waiting behind the headline. For weeks after the arrest, the Cynthia Gonzalez case was no longer an old investigation sitting quietly in an Arlington police file. It had become an active legal matter. A woman was accused. Prosecutors were examining the evidence. Investigators were defending the work that had brought the case back to life. And somewhere beneath all of it was Cynthia, 25 years old, gone since 1991, still waiting for justice. The arrest of Janie Perkins had created a powerful sense of finality, but investigators knew an arrest was only one step. They had spent decades trying to determine what happened to Cynthia. Now they had to demonstrate that the evidence could support the accusation. That meant returning to the beginning. September 16th, still 1991. Cynthia left her Arlington home. She was going to meet a client. There was nothing about that decision that suggested she was walking into history. She did not know that her name would remain in police records for decades. She did not know that investigators would eventually revisit her case through a university classroom. She did not know that a woman connected to her life would be arrested more than 3 decades later. And she certainly could not know that even that arrest would not guarantee an ending. Her ex-husband reported her missing the next day. The search began. Then her vehicle was discovered on the 900 block of Cedar Springs Terrace. That vehicle became a silent witness. It had been left behind. Cynthia was gone. The location mattered because it created a physical gap between the last known movements of Cynthia and the place where her body was eventually found. 5 days later, investigators discovered the body of a woman on private property in rural Johnson County, off County Road 313. She had been shot multiple times. The body was identified through fingerprints. Cynthia Gonzalez. The case had a victim. It had a location. It had a timeline. But it did not have a killer. For decades, that remained the problem. The investigation did not simply disappear. Detectives worked it. People were questioned. Leads were followed. The relationships surrounding Cynthia were examined. And Janie Perkins became one of the names that investigators could not completely eliminate. The connection was personal. Perkins and Cynthia were friends. They shared a romantic partner. And that relationship had changed shortly before Cynthia's disappearance. According to Arlington police, the man told Perkins that he was ending his relationship with her and choosing Cynthia. Investigators considered the possibility that jealousy or resentment could have played a role. But investigators also knew something else. A motive does not prove a murder. It only explains why detectives might look harder at one person. They needed evidence. They needed something that could connect suspicion to action. In 1991, they did not have enough to make an arrest. Perkins remained free. The years passed, and the case became one of those investigations that seemed destined to remain unanswered. Then the file was opened again. Not because someone suddenly discovered a dramatic piece of forensic evidence. Not because a killer walked into a police station. Not because a confession appeared overnight. The case moved because investigators looked again. That detail matters. Cold cases are often portrayed as mysteries solved by one miraculous clue. Real investigations are usually less dramatic. They involve old paperwork, old names, old interviews, old assumptions. Someone reads something that another investigator read 30 years earlier. But this time, the reader asks a different question. That was what happened with Cynthia's case. The Arlington Police Department assigned a current homicide detective to review it in 2024. The detective initially saw no obvious new lead. There was no easy breakthrough waiting inside the file. But the case remained open. Then the department partnered with the University of Texas at Arlington. The collaboration gave selected criminology and criminal justice students access to real cold cases. Cynthia's murder was among them. The students could not examine physical evidence, but they could study investigative report. They could look at the chronology. They could examine statements. They could question the assumptions surrounding the original investigation. And they did. The students focused on the people surrounding Cynthia. Perkins quickly became important. The relationship. The breakup. The absence of a verified alibi. The 2 voluntary polygraph examinations. The statements attributed to Perkins during the original investigation. None of those facts alone proved murder. But together, they formed a pattern that investigators believed deserved another look. The students brought questions to the detective. The detectives began conducting additional research. Witnesses were reconsidered. Old information was re-examined. And according to police, investigators eventually located witnesses who claimed Perkins had admitted involvement in Cynthia's murder. That was the new investigative foundation. The police said those witnesses provided specific details. Investigators compared those details with evidence already contained in the original case file. They believed the accounts were consistent. The case began moving rapidly. The renewed investigation did not erase the decades of uncertainty. Instead, it gave detectives a new reason to reconsider what had already been known. That distinction is critical. They were not suddenly discovering Cynthia. They were rediscovering the case. They were asking whether information that had existed for years could be interpreted differently when combined with newly developed witness accounts. The result was enough for investigators to move toward an arrest. They consulted the Tarrant County District Attorney's Office. A warrant was obtained. And then came November 6th, SIL 2025. The U.S. Marshals North Texas Fugitive Task Force located Janie Perkins in AZLE, Texas. She was 63. The woman investigators had questioned decades earlier was now under arrest for capital murder. The arrest was made without incident. For the public, the story seemed almost impossible. 34 years. One missing woman. One unresolved murder. One suspect. One arrest. The phrase cold case, solved suddenly, seemed obvious. But inside the legal system, the word solved meant something much more complicated. A detective could believe the evidence pointed to Perkins. A police department could announce an arrest. A prosecutor could present the case to a grand jury, but none of those steps could replace a conviction. Perkins remained presumed innocent. Her arrest did not establish that she had killed Cynthia. The allegations had to be tested, and the evidence had to withstand that test. That is where the passage of time became dangerous. A case from 1991 is not a case from 2025. The people are different. The world is different. The evidence has aged. Witness memories have changed. And some witnesses are no longer available at all. A prosecutor attempting to present a 34-year-old murder must work with what remains. There is no way to recreate the original moment. There is no way to bring back the people who are gone. There is no way to rewind the clock and conduct the interviews again. The investigation has to live with the record created decades earlier. That record now included the claims about Perkins. It included the original investigation. It included the circumstances surrounding Cynthia's disappearance. And it included the evidence collected in 1991. But the legal question was narrower. Was there enough evidence to indict? That question moved the case into the grand jury process. And as the legal review approached, the story began to change. The arrest had created certainty in the public imagination. The grand jury would demand something different. Proof. The difference between those two words would become enormous. The family had waited decades for the police to identify someone. Now they had to wait to see whether the accusation could survive. For Cynthia's relatives, the arrest was likely to bring conflicting emotions: relief, anger, hope, fear. After 34 years, the possibility of a courtroom had finally appeared. But the possibility of a courtroom is not the same as a courtroom. And the possibility of justice is not the same as justice. The case still had to move through the legal system. That meant prosecutors would have to examine every weakness, every witness, every statement, every piece of evidence, every uncertainty, because a defense attorney would ask the same question. How reliable was the memory? When was the alleged admission made? Who heard it? What exactly was said? Was it documented at the time? Could the statement be independently confirmed? Was there physical evidence connecting Perkins to the killing? Could the prosecution prove her specific role? Could the case withstand reasonable doubt after more than 3 decades? These were not technicalities. They were the foundation of the justice system, and they were about to determine the fate of one of Texas's most talked about cold cases. The case had already survived investigators. It had survived retirement. It had survived lost records and aging witnesses. It had survived decades of silence. Now it faced its most difficult opponent: uncertainty. The same uncertainty that had kept the case open for decades was now being placed under a different microscope. Police had to show why the new investigation was credible. Prosecutors had to decide what could be presented. The grand jury had to decide whether the case should proceed. And the public had to wait. Then, in early 2026, the case reached the moment that could change everything. The grand jury considered the evidence. The same case that had produced an arrest now faced an independent legal review. For Cynthia's family, this was another date on an already endless timeline. 1991, 1992, 1993, 1994, 1995. Now 2026. Years had become decades. The case had moved from one generation of investigators to another. And still, the question was the same. Who killed Cynthia Gonzalez? The police believed the renewed investigation had identified the person responsible, but the legal system was about to decide whether that belief was supported strongly enough to continue. Then came the decision. No bill. The grand jury declined to indict Janie Perkins. The capital murder case did not move forward from that grand jury presentation. The arrest that had appeared to end the mystery suddenly became another chapter in it. The reaction was immediate. For people who had followed the case, the outcome was shocking. A woman had been arrested after more than 3 decades. Investigators had described the renewed investigation as a breakthrough. Witnesses had allegedly provided information about Perkins's involvement. And yet the grand jury did not indict. That decision did not mean Cynthia's murder had not happened. It did not mean investigators had fabricated their concern. It did not establish that Perkins was innocent of every allegation investigators had made. It meant that the grand jury did not find sufficient grounds to return an indictment based on the case presented. That distinction matters, because the public often wants a simple ending. Guilty, not guilty, solved, unsolved. But real cold cases rarely offer clean endings. Sometimes an arrest happens without a conviction. Sometimes a suspect is identified but cannot be prosecuted. Sometimes prosecutors believe a person committed the crime but cannot prove it beyond the required legal standard. Sometimes the truth may exist without enough evidence to establish it in court. Cynthia's case had entered that uncomfortable space. The investigation had moved forward. The legal process had stopped it. But the story was not finished. Because there was still a murder. There was still a family. There was still a woman whose life ended in 1991. And there was still a person responsible. Somewhere. The no-bill decision did not erase the evidence. It did not erase the investigation. It did not erase the witness statements. It did not erase the original case file. And it certainly did not erase Cynthia. Her name remained. Her photograph remained. The dates remained. September 16th. September 17th. September 22nd. November 6th. SIL 2025. And then the grand jury decision in 2026. Each date represented another stage in a story that refused to end. The most remarkable part was that the case had come so close. For a moment, investigators believed the decades of uncertainty had finally produced an answer. The suspect was found. The warrant was executed. The arrest was made. The headlines appeared. Then the legal system demanded more, and the case returned to uncertainty. That is the cruelest part of a cold case. Sometimes solving the mystery does not mean proving it. Sometimes identifying the person investigators believe responsible does not bring justice. Sometimes the distance between suspicion and certainty is 34 years wide. Cynthia Gonzalez crossed that distance without ever knowing it. She left home in 1991, expecting an ordinary meeting. She never returned. Her family spent decades waiting for an answer. And when an answer finally appeared, it was not strong enough to become a conviction. The case remained suspended. Not forgotten. Not erased. Suspended. And somewhere in that suspension is the possibility that another piece of evidence could still change everything. A witness could remember something. A document could surface. A statement could be corroborated. A new forensic technique could reveal something the original investigators could not see. Cold cases have a strange relationship with time. Time destroys evidence. But time also changes technology. It creates new investigative methods. It allows new detectives to see old files differently. It brings new generations into investigations that began before they were born. That is what happened with Cynthia. A case from 1991 entered a university classroom in 2025. Students who were not alive when Cynthia disappeared began reading the report. They asked questions. Detectives listened. A woman was arrested. And then the grand jury said no. That sequence is now part of the case forever. The arrest cannot be removed from the history. Neither can the no-bill decision. Both happened. Both matter. And both leave the same haunting question behind. What happened during the hours after Cynthia left Arlington? The official record can describe where she was found. It can describe how she was identified. It can describe the investigation. It can describe the arrest. It can describe the grand jury decision. But there is still a space between those facts, a space where the final truth remains hidden. And that space is where Cynthia Gonzalez's cold case continues to lie. 34 years of investigation, one shocking arrest, one unexpected legal reversal, and a family still waiting for the answer that every cold case ultimately demands. Not who investigators suspect, not who the headlines accuse, not who a theory points toward, but who can be proven responsible for the death of Cynthia Gonzalez. Until that answer survives every question, the file remains open in the only sense that truly matters. The past is still unresolved. The name is still remembered. And the woman who disappeared in Arlington in 1991 is still waiting for the final chapter that the justice system has not yet been able to write. The grand jury had said no. But no did not erase the murder. It did not erase the night Cynthia Gonzalez disappeared. It did not erase the abandoned vehicle. It did not erase the body found in Johnson County. And it did not erase 34 years of questions. For the people who had followed the case, the no-bill decision created an uncomfortable silence. The arrest had been loud. The arrest had made headlines. The arrest had revived memories that had been buried for decades. Then, almost as quickly as the case had returned to the spotlight, the legal path narrowed again. But the investigation had left behind something that could not simply disappear. A record. 34 years of records. Thousands of pages of information. Names. Dates. Interviews. Reports. And the statements that had brought detectives back to Janie Perkins. The story was no longer only about what happened in 1991. It was also about why the case had remained unsolved for so long. That question became impossible to ignore. Because if investigators had been looking at Perkins decades earlier, why had nothing happened? Why did the case remain open? Why did an arrest take 34 years? And why did the case finally move after students at the University of Texas at Arlington began examining the old file? Those questions transformed the story. The mystery was no longer only about a murder. It was about the investigation itself. Cold cases often contain layers of history. The first layer is the crime. The second is the original investigation. The third is everything that happened afterward. And Cynthia's case had accumulated all three. In 1991, detectives were working with the tools available at the time. They had interviews. They had fingerprints. They had physical evidence. They had witness statements. They had human memory. And they had a crime scene that could not explain itself. Cynthia's vehicle had been found abandoned. Her body had been discovered miles away. She had been shot multiple times. Someone knew where she was. Someone knew what happened. But investigators could not make that person appear in court. The investigation moved through the people closest to Cynthia. Perkins was one of them. She knew Cynthia. She had a personal connection to her. She had also been affected by the romantic relationship that connected the two women. According to police, the man they both had a relationship with had chosen Cynthia. That decision had occurred weeks before the murder. To investigators, it was a potential motive, but motive alone could not bridge the gap. There was still no clear chain showing exactly what happened. No courtroom confession. No conviction. No final answer. The case went cold. Years later, that old file was still waiting. And when the Arlington detective reopened it in 2024, the first challenge was obvious. Where do you begin when the investigation is older than many of the people now working it? You begin with the timeline. You begin with the original report. You begin with the names. You begin with the smallest details. Because a cold case does not announce where the answer is hiding. Sometimes the most important information is buried in a sentence written 30 years earlier. Sometimes it is a witness whose name appears only once. Sometimes it is an inconsistency that seemed insignificant at the time. Sometimes it is a relationship that investigators understood differently decades later. That is what made the Utah partnership so unusual. The students approached the case without the emotional history carried by the original investigator. They had not spent years chasing the same suspect. They had not built an investigative theory in 1991 and watched it fail. They were looking at the material as students. And sometimes fresh eyes create uncomfortable questions. Why was this person interviewed? What did they say? Did anyone challenge the statement? Was there another interpretation? What happened to the lead? Was it ever completely followed? The students communicated with detectives. The detectives reconsidered the material, and the name Janie Perkins continued to appear. The investigation moved back toward her. Witnesses were revisited. According to police, investigators identified people who claimed Perkins had admitted involvement. That information became significant because it gave detectives a possible bridge between the original suspicion and the renewed investigation. But there was another problem. 34 years. If a witness claimed they heard something decades earlier, how could investigators establish that the memory was reliable? How could they separate what the witness actually remembered from what the witness had heard later? How could they establish when the statement was supposedly made? How could they determine whether the details matched evidence that had never been publicly known? Those questions were unavoidable. The detectives needed more than an accusation. They needed consistency. According to Arlington police, the witness accounts contained specific details that aligned with evidence in the original case. That was enough to push the investigation forward. The case was no longer simply a historical review. It was an active homicide investigation again. Detectives consulted prosecutors. A warrant was obtained, and Janie Perkins was arrested. For a moment, the 34-year gap seemed to collapse. The woman who had once been questioned was now facing the most serious accusation possible: capital murder. The charge carried enormous weight. But the courtroom had not yet heard the evidence. The grand jury had not yet made its decision, and Cynthia's family was still waiting. That waiting is one of the least visible parts of a cold case. The public sees the arrest, the cameras, the headlines, the courthouse. But families experience something different. They remember the person before the crime. They remember ordinary moments: a conversation, a meal, a birthday, a voice, a face, a person who had plans. Cynthia was not a case number. She was 25. She had a life. She had people who knew her. And then suddenly she was gone. The years afterward could not restore what had been taken. No arrest could give her family another day with her. No conviction could reverse 1991. Justice could only do one thing: establish responsibility. And that was why the grand jury mattered. If an indictment came, the case could continue. If it did not, the arrest would remain only an accusation. The evidence would remain contested, and the mystery would survive. When the grand jury returned a no bill, that survival became reality. The case had reached a legal wall. But walls are not always ending. Sometimes they are boundaries. They show investigators exactly what must be overcome. The no-bill decision forced a distinction between what police believed and what could be proven. That distinction is fundamental. A detective can believe a witness. A prosecutor can believe the investigation is credible. A family can believe they finally know what happened. But the law requires something more: evidence. Reliable evidence. Admissible evidence. Evidence strong enough to overcome reasonable doubt. That standard exists because accusations can destroy lives. And in a case 34 years old, the danger of uncertainty becomes even greater. People remember differently. Documents become incomplete. Evidence can deteriorate. Witnesses become unavailable. The original investigators may no longer be there to explain why certain decisions were made. The people involved in the original case may have completely different lives. Some may not even know that the case was reopened. And that means every new investigation is partly an archaeological excavation. Detectives are digging through the past. They are reconstructing a world that no longer exists. The streets look different. The technology is different. The people are older. But the crime remains fixed. September 1991. That date never changes. Cynthia left. She did not come home. Her vehicle was found. Her body was found. And the investigation began. Everything afterward is an attempt to reconstruct those missing hours. That is what makes the case so haunting. The most important part of the story may have lasted only hours, but investigators have spent decades trying to understand it. The arrest in 2025 created a possible explanation. The grand jury decision in 2026 weakened the legal path toward that explanation. But neither event answered every question. And now, the case returns to the place where it has spent much of its existence, between evidence and uncertainty. There is still a possibility that additional information could emerge. Someone who was silent may decide to speak. Someone who remembers a conversation may finally understand its significance. A forgotten document could surface. A modern forensic technique could someday reveal information unavailable in 1991. Technology has changed dramatically. Investigators today can examine evidence in ways detectives could not imagine 3 decades ago. The technology cannot manufacture evidence. It cannot recreate a missing witness. It cannot guarantee that a degraded sample will produce an answer. And it cannot turn suspicion into certainty. That is why Cynthia's case remains difficult. The investigation has already traveled through several generations of policing. The original detectives worked with one set of tools. The 2024 investigator worked with another. The Utah students approached the case from an academic perspective. The 2025 investigators followed new leads. The grand jury examined the accusation. And still, the central mystery remained. Who is responsible? The answer may exist somewhere inside the record, but finding a possible answer is not the same as proving it. That is the difference between a cold case and a solved case. A solved case is not simply a case where investigators have a theory. It is a case where the evidence establishes what happened, and Cynthia's story has not reached that point. Not yet. Her murder remains a reminder that time can create two opposite forces. Time can destroy. A time can also reveal. A witness may remember something differently. A relationship may finally make sense. An investigator may see a pattern that was invisible before. A new generation may ask a question that no one asked in 1991. That is what happened when the old file reached the Utah classroom. The students were not there when Cynthia disappeared. They did not know her. They did not know the original detective. They did not experience the investigation as it unfolded. They simply opened the file. And the file opened a door. Behind it was a 34-year-old murder. Behind that murder was a young woman whose life had ended far from home. Behind that was a suspect who had been questioned decades earlier. And behind that was a trail of unanswered questions. The students asked. The detectives listened. The investigation moved. An arrest followed. Then the grand jury said no. And the case returned to uncertainty. That sequence may seem like failure, but for investigators, it may also represent something else. Progress. Because now the case has been examined again. The evidence has been reconsidered. The old assumptions have been challenged. The witnesses have been revisited. And the investigation has generated a new record. That record could matter someday. If another piece of evidence appears, investigators will not be starting from zero. They will have the work of the original detective. They will have the renewed investigation. They will have the student research. They will have the witness information. They will have the legal history of the arrest and grand jury. Every attempt adds another layer. And sometimes, the final breakthrough comes from a combination of layers rather than one dramatic discovery. That is the hope. But hope is not closure. Cynthia's family has already learned that. They waited 34 years for an arrest. When the arrest came, they still did not receive a final legal answer. The case had moved from silence to headlines and back into uncertainty. And somewhere in between was a woman who never got the chance to grow older. Cynthia should have been 40, then 50, then 60. But the world remembers her at 25. That is what violent crime does. It freezes a life at its final moment. Everyone else keeps moving. The victim does not. The calendar turns. The city grows. People marry. People have children. Children grow up. New generations arrive. And the victim remains the same age, 25. Forever. That is why cold cases are more than old files. They are unfinished lives. Every unanswered question is attached to a person. Every missing piece belongs to someone who deserved to know the truth. And every year without resolution becomes another year in which the killer, if still alive, has lived with knowledge that Cynthia's family does not have. That imbalance is what keeps investigators returning to old cases. The hope that somewhere, somehow, the truth is still recoverable. The Cynthia Gonzalez investigation has already shown that old cases can move again. A dormant file can become active. A forgotten name can return. A student can ask a question. A detective can follow it. A witness can speak. A suspect can be arrested. And yet, even after all of that, justice can remain just beyond reach. That is where the case stands now. Not at the beginning. Not at the end. Somewhere in between. The murder remains real. The victim remains identified. The suspect was arrested. The grand jury did not indict. And the unanswered question remains exactly where it has been for more than 3 decades. Who killed Cynthia Gonzalez? There are theories. There are investigative conclusions. There are witness claims. There are records. There are decades of work. But until the evidence can establish the truth in a courtroom, the mystery remains. And that is why the story of Cynthia Gonzalez refuses to disappear. Because 34 years after she left her Arlington home, the past came back. It brought an arrest. It brought headlines. It brought hope. Then it brought another unanswered question. The case that seemed solved was suddenly unresolved again. The file closed. The lights in the courthouse went out. The investigators returned to their work. And Cynthia's name remained. Still 25. Still remembered. Still waiting. Somewhere beneath the old reports and the decades of silence, the truth may still exist. It may be hidden in a memory, a document, a witness, a piece of evidence, or a detail that has been sitting unnoticed since 1991. The question is not whether Cynthia's story mattered. It always has. The question is whether the remaining evidence can finally tell the story completely. Until then, the cold case remains what it has always been. A murder without a conviction. A family without complete closure. And a question that refuses to die. By the time the old case file was opened again, almost everyone who had once known the details had changed. Some had moved away. Some had forgotten. Some had convinced themselves that whatever happened in 1987 belonged to another lifetime. But the file had not forgotten. The dates were still there. The photographs were still there. The statements were still there. And buried beneath layers of yellowed paperwork was the detail that had always bothered investigators most. The victim's last confirmed movement had never made complete sense. She had been seen leaving the place where she was supposed to be. After that, the timeline became a blank space. Not an ordinary blank space. A dangerous one. Because somewhere inside those missing hours was the answer. The investigators knew the victim had not simply vanished. Something had happened between the last confirmed sighting and the moment her vehicle was discovered. The question was what? In 1987, detectives had tried to reconstruct those hours. They had drawn timelines on paper. They had marked locations on maps. They had written names beside time. They had called witnesses. They had returned to the same questions again and again. What time did you see her? Where was she standing? Who was with her? What was she wearing? Did she appear frightened? Did she mention anyone? Did she say where she was going? Did you hear a vehicle? Did you notice another person? Every answer created another possibility. Every contradiction created another problem. One witness remembered a vehicle. Another remembered only the victim. One person believed the victim had left alone. Another thought someone had been waiting nearby. None of it was enough. The case remained open. Then the years began to erase the edges. The first anniversary passed. Then another. Then 5. Then 10. Eventually, the murder became one of those stories that older residents remembered but younger residents had never heard. The victim's name stopped appearing in newspapers. The original detectives retired. The younger officers inherited newer cases. The file moved from desk to desk. But the unanswered question remained. Who was responsible? For a long time, investigators had focused on the people closest to the victim. That was standard. The people closest to a victim often know more than they admit. They know the routines. They know the relationships. They know the arguments. They know the places the victim visits. They know who she trusts. They know who she fears. And sometimes they know the final destination. But knowing someone does not make a person guilty. That distinction had haunted the original investigation. The detectives had suspects. They had theories. They had motives. What they lacked was the final connection. The physical evidence could not tell them enough. The witness accounts were incomplete. The technology of the time was limited. And the investigation eventually reached a wall. That wall became the cold case. Decades later, the new detectives approached the file differently. They did not begin by asking who looked suspicious. They began by asking what could be proven. That changed everything. Instead of following the old assumptions, they rebuilt the timeline, minute by minute, location by location, statement by statement. The first confirmed sighting, the last confirmed sighting, the discovery of the vehicle, the discovery of the body. Every known movement was placed on the timeline. Then the gaps were marked. There were several, but one gap mattered more than the others. It was the period when the victim disappeared from the known record. That was where investigators concentrated. They looked at roads. They looked at businesses. They looked at residences. They examined old maps. They checked names from the original report, and they discovered something unsettling. One of the locations mentioned repeatedly in the original investigation had never been fully explained. It was not dramatic. It was not the kind of place that would attract attention. There was no abandoned warehouse, no secret basement, no hidden tunnel, just an ordinary location that had existed in the background of the original story. That made it more interesting, because ordinary places are where extraordinary crimes can disappear. A parking lot, a roadside business, a residential street, a quiet intersection, places where nobody expects history to be hiding. The investigators returned to the location. The original buildings were gone or changed. The neighborhood looked different. The roads had been altered. New construction had erased some of the old landscape, but the map still provided clues. The distance between locations, the possible travel time, the roads available in 1987, the route a vehicle could have taken, and suddenly, the timeline began to narrow. Not enough to solve the case, but enough to challenge the old assumption. If the victim had traveled directly from the last known location, she could have reached the area in a certain amount of time. If someone had been with her, the timeline changed. If she had stopped somewhere, it changed again. If the vehicle had been moved after the crime, everything changed. The investigators needed to know which possibility was consistent with the evidence. They returned to the original witness statements. One by one, some witnesses remembered almost nothing. Others remembered too much. And one statement stood out. A witness had described seeing the victim near a vehicle. The description had seemed unimportant decades earlier, but now the investigators had another question. What kind of vehicle? Was it the victim's vehicle? Was it another vehicle? Could the witness identify the person nearby? The original report contained only fragments. The witness had not known what those details meant. In 1987, neither did the investigators. Now they had 30 years of hindsight. That changed the meaning of old information. A detail that once seemed meaningless could suddenly become significant. The investigators began comparing the statement with other evidence. The vehicle, the timeline, the location, the known relationships. Nothing immediately solved the murder, but the pieces were beginning to point in the same direction. That was enough to keep going. Cold case investigations often depend on persistence more than drama. There is no single moment when the entire truth suddenly appears. Instead, investigators spend hours looking at information that everyone else has already seen. They read the same paragraph. Then they read it again. They notice a name. They look up the name. They find another report. That report contains another name. That name leads to another interview. And suddenly, a 30-year-old case begins moving. That was what happened here. The investigation became a chain. One detail connected to another. One witness connected to another. One location connected to another. And eventually, the investigators returned to the person they believed had been overlooked. Not necessarily the most obvious suspect. Not necessarily the person who had appeared most suspicious in 1987. Someone else. Someone whose connection to the victim had been considered peripheral. Someone whose name had appeared in the original records but had never become central. The new investigators wanted to know why. Why had that person been there? Why had their account changed? Why had one witness remembered something differently? Why had the original detectives not followed that led further? The answers were not immediate, but the questions were becoming sharper. And then they found an inconsistency. It was small, almost invisible. A time, a location, a statement that did not fit perfectly with another statement. In a modern investigation, that kind of discrepancy might be checked immediately. In 1987, it had been buried among hundreds of other details. The new detectives checked it. Then they checked it again. The discrepancy mattered, because if the original timeline was wrong by even a small amount, one person's story became much harder to believe. That person had said they were somewhere else. The old statement placed them there, but another piece of information suggested otherwise. Investigators began rebuilding the sequence. The victim left. The witness saw her. The vehicle appeared. The location changed. The body was eventually found. The time between those events became the focus, and slowly, the investigators began to believe that the crime had not unfolded the way the original investigation assumed. That was the first major shift. The second came from forensic evidence, not a dramatic piece of DNA suddenly appearing out of nowhere. The evidence had existed for years, but technology had changed. Modern forensic science could examine biological material in ways that investigators in 1987 could not. A sample that had once produced little useful information could now be re-examined. The detectives submitted evidence for advanced testing. Then they waited. Waiting is part of every forensic investigation. The evidence goes into a laboratory. The case returns to paperwork. Days become weeks. Investigators continue working other cases. Then one morning, the phone rings. A result is available. That moment can change everything. But before the result could be interpreted, investigators had to make sure the evidence was properly documented. Where did the sample come from? Who collected it? How had it been stored? Had the chain of custody been preserved? Could the laboratory result be trusted? A cold case cannot afford shortcuts. The entire point is reliability. The evidence has to survive decades of scrutiny. The investigators knew that. They did not want a dramatic headline. They wanted something that could withstand a courtroom. Then the laboratory returned the result. There was a DNA profile. It did not immediately identify the killer, but it excluded some possibility. That was progress. Another comparison followed. Then another. The investigators began narrowing the field. The profile belonged to a male. That alone did not solve anything. But it changed the investigation. For the first time, investigators had a biological clue that could be compared against people connected to the case. The old suspect list was reopened. Names were checked. Some were eliminated. Others remained. Then investigators found a person whose connection to the original case had been overlooked. He had been interviewed in 1987. His name was in the file. His statement was there. But his role had never been fully examined. Now his name looked different. The investigators compared his timeline with the forensic evidence. There were questions. He had given an explanation for his whereabouts, but the explanation depended heavily on memory. 30 years later, investigators had something memory could not change: DNA. The sample had survived, and the profile had survived with it. The detectives needed a direct comparison. They obtained a lawful reference sample. The laboratory performed the test. Then came the moment nobody in the department could ignore. The DNA matched. Not a vague similarity, not a speculative connection. A match that investigators believed directly linked the individual to biological evidence from the original case. The old file suddenly became something else. It was no longer only a historical mystery. It contained modern forensic evidence. The investigators returned to every earlier statement: the timeline, the location, the witness, the vehicle, the relationship, the old interview. Everything had to be re-evaluated. The suspect's original statement now looked different. What had sounded plausible in 1987 became difficult to explain. The detectives reconstructed the movements. They compared the time. They compared the location. They compared the evidence. The pieces were no longer floating separately. They were connecting. And that was when the cold case truly changed. For decades, investigators had asked whether the evidence was enough to identify the person responsible. Now they had a biological link. The DNA did not tell the entire story. It could not explain motive. It could not describe the conversation between the victim and the suspect. It could not tell investigators what happened inside the missing hour, but it placed the suspect in a relationship with the evidence. That was powerful. The investigation accelerated. Old witnesses were contacted again. Some were shocked to hear the case had moved. Others had never stopped thinking about it. One former witness remembered the suspect. Another remembered a vehicle. Another remembered an argument. Each memory was evaluated carefully. The investigators were no longer searching randomly. They had a target. They had evidence. And they had a timeline. But there was still one question. Why? Why would someone connected to the victim commit the crime? Why had the victim trusted the person? Why had the suspect's original story survived for so long? The answers began to emerge through old records. There had been tension. There had been financial pressure. There had been personal conflict. But none of those details mattered as much as the evidence itself. The detectives did not need a perfect motive. They needed proof. And the proof was becoming stronger. The cold case had survived because the original investigation lacked the technology to connect the suspect to the evidence. Now technology had closed that gap. The investigators looked at the DNA result again. They knew what it meant. They also knew what it did not mean. A match could connect a person to evidence. It could not automatically explain when or how the biological material had been deposited. Context mattered. That was why the rest of the investigation was still necessary. The DNA was one piece. The timeline was another. The witness statements were another. The old inconsistencies were another. Together, they created a picture, and the picture was becoming difficult to ignore. The person connected to the biological evidence had once told investigators a story. That story had survived for decades. Now the forensic evidence challenged it. The detectives went back to the original interview. They read the words slowly. They compared them with what they knew now. Then they asked the question that had haunted the case since 1987. What if the answer had been sitting inside this file the entire time? What if the investigators had been looking at the right person but simply lacked the evidence needed to prove it? What if the cold case had not been impossible? What if it had only been waiting for science to catch up? The possibility was enough to change the atmosphere inside the investigation. The file that had once gathered dust was now moving rapidly. Phones began ringing. Reports were updated. Laboratory results were attached. Detectives prepared the case for prosecutors. And for the first time in decades, the word arrest entered the investigation. But an arrest would have consequences. A name would become public. A family would receive answers they had waited decades to hear. A community would remember a crime it thought had disappeared into history. And somewhere, the person investigators believed responsible would finally hear the accusation. The cold case had been silent for 38 years. Now the silence was about to break. And all because a tiny biological trace had survived the decades.